Welcome back, my name is Teresa and I'm very much alive. If you're new here, welcome. I have an awful, garbage, filthy mouth where sometimes, just sometimes, I tend to use the word fuck as a comma, I know. I'm a 13-year-old boy. If you're not into that or weird stuff in general, this is definitely not the place for you. Feel free to X out the video here. No harm, no foul. But I'll remember our Tom fondly. Or time fondly, whatever you think is funnier. Boys, boys, boys. Listen, you know I have a very weird relationship when it comes to melt. Some would classify it as daddy issues. When the Mary Jane palette was released, I lost my mind. The Anne inside me was clutching her CVS receipts and screaming, yes! And I knew I had to get it. As someone who has been craving basic goodness, especially with the Rust palette, I knew I was going to be picking this up during the Sephora sale. With that said, let me tell you a little bit about this palette first.
The new Mary Jane palette, inspired by the dense tones found in cannabis smoke and the luster of crystal-coated buds. She's elevating your classy smoky eye with gunmetal and hazy crystalline hues.
So the Mary Jane palette retails for $58, which is the standard pricing when it comes to Melts palettes, especially in this size. The packaging is adorable. Not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but I really love the little touch of sparkles within the letters. I think it makes for a fun snow globe look, and honestly looks a hell of a lot better than the Natasha Denona Love palette. That shit's all kinds of fucking cheesy. This one is tastefully done, like a tasteful nude. We love that. So here is the color story. You'll notice that there's some embossing in the pans. And this is kind of where I feel like it's beating a dead horse. Like, I get it, y'all like to smoke, whatever, who cares? But there's only so many times you can reference marijuana or smoke. It's like, I kind of feel like they're scraping the bottom of the barrel with this theme. I don't have any issues with marijuana in a whole. I think it's fine. It should be legal. Shit, my stepfather smokes weed. It doesn't bother me. If anything, it's hilarious. In thinking of themes for this brand, how many more of these fucking ideas do you have? You could do only so much at this point, right? Now, with that said, for $58, what exactly do you get? So for this portion of the review, I'm just gonna break it down by shade, and I'm actually gonna keep the palette down because I'm afraid if I keep jostling it around, this shit will go everywhere. So we're going to start with this side and we're going to end over here. Mary Jane is described as a light gold sparkling metallic shade. When I first used this shade with glitter glue, it applied like absolute dog shit. It was patchy and I couldn't for the life of me try to even this shade out on my eyelid. When used with glitter glue, it creates this really gnarly fucking texture that basically makes my eyelids look like a wrinkly ball sack. And ultimately makes it look like my eye got stung by a bee. It's very weird and bulbous. Not a fan. When I applied it with a finger, I got a little bit of payoff, like just a scotch. But the glitter bukkake in this shade is unfucking real. After taking multiple showers, I'm still finding glitter all over my fucking body. No ma'am, I'm not trying to make myself look like a fat fucking disco ball, okay? Usually I'm not particularly eager to apply these shadows with setting spray. And the reason for that is because I experience what I lovingly refer as spicy butthole effect, which is a nice way of saying a chemical burn. Certain shimmers mixed with setting spray just fuck my ass up. So I was nervous about using it, but I did, and I'm happy to say, while I didn't experience a reaction on my eyes, it just made it that much more impossible to use. Yes, you do get a more solid opacity. It's still not very easy to use. In this video, I'm gonna show you a few looks that I created with this palette, and granted, I think what I have on my face today is probably the best iteration of it. And again, this is not winning any awards by any means. Please know I'm not a makeup artist. I'm just a bitch trying to cover up my anxiety with metallic shimmers. That's all this is. Now, when I used this shade as a topper, I didn't feel like it added really anything to my look. If anything, kind of fucked it up. For today's look, I applied like a teeny amount in the inner corner of my eyelid. And I think this is the best I'm gonna get with this shade. For something that is so metallic and sparkly and pan, what I have on my eye is probably the equivalent of ejaculating too early. Gasper is a beautiful matte olive brown shade. This one was great. I found that this one was probably considered like a warm tone matte shade out of the palette. It had excellent pigmentation and blended beautifully with the other mattes in this palette. I didn't notice any fading or patchiness when using this shadow. The next shade is Sweet Lucy, and this is an olive gold metallic shade. This shade has the worst fucking fallout in the world. It was like I was working in a coal mine and I just like got out of the fucking mine and there was soot all over my face. This is impossible impossible to fucking clean. Keep in mind, I did use glitter glue when using this shade and it still fucking got everywhere. My biggest issue with this shade is that it's just so loose and so fucking crumbly. As I would blend it out, the shadow would just fall down my face. On the lid, it looked okay, but it would cease to exist beyond the lid. This shade not only crumbled into my eyes, but actually also fell into my water, which is a fucking first for me, okay? That was terrifying. It's weird because when you're trying to like even the shade out to like have, you know, an even coat on your eyelid, it clumps in certain spots. And I think it really has to do with the glitter glue. I just don't think these shadows are meant to be used with glitter glue. It has some weird reaction where it just clumps up together and then creates this like wrinkly sack texture. But also in that same breath, if you don't use any sort of glitter glue, it just fucking flies everywhere and it doesn't stay put. This shade was beyond fucking annoying. The next shade is Bamba or Bamba or I don't know. I'm gonna be butchering these fucking names, by the way, just a heads up. This is a beautiful graphite shade, and I think besides the mattes, this was probably my favorite metallic shade of the palette. Yes, there was some fallout, but I found this applied beautifully with a dried brush and created a really beautiful depth in the outer corner. Sinsimula, I think that's how you pronounce it, is the next shade in the palette, and it's a deep brown matte shade. And this shade serves as the darkest matte in the palette. This was a lovely shade to use in the outer corner as well as the crease to add dimension. I found that this shade though wasn't as pigmented as the other mattes in the palette, so I did need to build it up to have a little bit more of a substantial opacity, but I found that this shade blended beautifully with the other shadows. So it's not a deal breaker that it wasn't super pigmented upon initial application. The next shade is Santa Maria, and this is a warmer gunmetal metallic shade. This shade is very similar to Bamba, and I kind of question if you really needed both of them. When you swatch them out, they look like there's a slight difference, but on the eye, kind of looks exactly the fucking same. In any case, I found that this shadow applied well with glitter glue as well as a dry brush. Didn't really notice any differences between them. There was some kick up, some fallout. Again, fallout is just really not easy to clean. If you are interested in purchasing this palette, definitely do your eye look first and then your base. Otherwise, you're just gonna have all these little fucking Taco Bell crumbles all over your goddamn cheeks. Other than that, I had no issues with this shade. Ruby is the next shade, and it's another brown matte. This is another one that I use in the crease to add a little bit of dimension. Again, no real issues with this matte shadow. It was pigmented, very easy to use, barely any kick up, barely any fallout. And I found that this was like the perfect shade, especially when I wanted to build a little brown gradient with the mattes. This was definitely one of my favorite matte shades in the palette. The next shade after that is Beau, and this is a bronze metallic shade. I fucked up the shade when I initially used it because I think on its own it's very beautiful, and it's actually what I have on my eye today. I think it's a very beautiful metallic bronze shade, and it kind of gives a really perfect brown smoky eye. That being said, I fucked it up the first time I used this shade because I tried to use the shade Cali, which is the last shade in this palette, as a topper, and it just fucking created this gnarly fucking texture, and it just fucked up the whole look. But I think on its own, it's very, very beautiful. On a dry brush, yes, there is some fallout. Yes, really fucking difficult to clean, but overall pretty easy to use. It does blend beautifully with the other matte shadows as well as some of the other shimmer shadows. It's a really good shade. The next shade is Mary, and it's the lightest matte brown shade in the palette. This matte requires to be built up to have a stronger opacity, but once done, it looks beautiful. It's perfect. It served as my primary crease shade when using this palette. This blended beautifully with the other mattes. I didn't notice any sort of patchiness or fading throughout the day. The shade was fine. Now the last shade in this palette is Cali, and this is a chunky fucking bitch. This shade is classified as like a light peachy gold shade, and it's very, very similar to the Mary Jane shade. Similar fucking formula and everything. This applied like shit on the eyes. And with glitter glue, it's a huge fucking mess. I did try it with a little bit of setting spray, and while it did have overall a better opacity, it still was very, very difficult to blend. It just dries down like cement on my eye. That is probably the best way I can describe it, other than it looking like a wrinkly ball sack on my face. The only use for this shade I feel like is kind of like an inner corner highlight, but in that same breath, the fallout from this shade is borderline fucking offensive. This shit will fucking live with you forever. I tried putting Cali on the inner corner, and not only did it come off like patchy and splotchy and just fucking impossible, I actually had to go over that shadow with a liquid eyeshadow just because I wanted just to have like this nice metallic pop in the corner. Like I need something else to do that with this palette. This palette does not have the capability of adding like a certain kind of like brightness to the eye. It's so fucking infuriating. It's really annoying because with glitter glue, it's patchy and on a dry brush, it barely shows up. I feel like the best application for this, from what I found out, is using either a really tiny detailed brush and like just kind of packing it on and blending it out ever so slightly and just leaving it alone, or just taking your finger and then gently patting it over another eyeshadow. But again, there's a fine line to it because not only is glitter bukkake fucking everywhere, the shadow has the ability to create a really gross texture on the lid. So you really just have to like pat it ever so slightly. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So as you can tell, I use one shade in the inner corner, literally the best I can do, and then gently tapping it on. And it doesn't look so bad, but like, like I don't think it really adds that much to the look. At the end of the day, I'm kind of torn about this palette. While I'm completely thrilled that I didn't pay full price for it because it's definitely not worth full price, I question if this was even worth 20% off. The best part about this palette was the mattes. Yes, they're boring, yes, they're basic. And in my eyes, I don't feel like they were the same quality as the mattes in the Rust palette. They're still workable and it'll get the job done. I really wish there was a little bit more variety in the matte shades, only because I feel like, well, yes, they do make a very beautiful smoky brown eye. There's only so much you can do with them. You know what I mean? Doesn't really leave you a lot of options to play with here. But at the end of the day, they did blend very well with each other. They had great longevity. I didn't notice any patchiness or fading throughout the course of the day when wearing these shadows. So they're not bad, they're fine. Now moving on to the metallic formula, it's kind of fucking weird. The two shades on either side of the palette, the topper shades, are probably some of the worst formula I have ever fucking used. They're messy, they create texture, they don't blend well, and it gets fucking everywhere. Again, I'm not being facetious when I say they get fucking everywhere. Think about it. Where do you think it could go? Nothing is more alarming than thinking you're turning into a unicorn because you're shitting out glitter. The remaining metallics are okay, except for Sweet Lucy. That shade, along with Mary Jane and Cali, need to be shot off into deep space and die. The other metallic shades, while incredibly messy, overall had nice pigmentation. They had good longevity, and I was able to blend the shades without it looking like a huge fucking science project. However, like I mentioned before, I currently have two different shimmers on my eyes, although my eyes look almost the same. This palette feels incredibly one note in that regard. Now the metallics weren't shit your pants amazing. When I compare this to the Rust palette, those shimmers were great. This one, I wouldn't compare the two. Guaranteed you have similar tones and similar shades in your collection currently. I'm disappointed because this brand has such huge inconsistencies between their launches. When they're good, they're fucking good. But when they're bad, they're fucking bad. And this one kind of falls in the middle. It wasn't the worst thing I tried. I did manage to make it work for me, but I don't think it was life-changing by any means. And with the steep price tag, I don't think this is a palette you must have. There are so many better options on the market right now that have similar color stories and less of a fucking headache to boot. If you really want this palette, do yourself a favor and dust off that Urban Decay Naked palette or the Naked Smoky or the Naked 2 and use one of those. If you want a cool tone palette and you want to spend some money, I highly recommend checking out the Natasha Denona Glam palette. Or if you want to save a couple of bucks, check out the ColourPop Stone Cold Fox palette. Those two cool tone color stories are fabulous and you're not going to experience the headache that you will with this palette. Bottom line, you will not experience any FOMO here, boys. None whatsoever. Now I want to hear from y'all. Let me know down below if you picked up this palette or if you're going to be skipping out on it. Let me know because I love hearing from y'all. And with that said, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it as always. Feel free to like, comment, hit that subscribe button, it's free, and hit that bell icon for notification of all my future posts. Follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon. To all my beautiful, wonderful patron bubbies, I love your adorable, delicious little faces. I just want to squeeze you all up and then ultimately gobble you up because I am a monster. But in any case, we will be one and it will be great. If you want to know what is currently on my face along with where to get this fun thing, not my merch, it's just fun. I kind of felt like I was going to the beach today. What can I say? If you want to know where to get this, along with where to find my podcast and my merch, everything will be listed in the description box below. And I'll see What is this hand movement? Okay. I'm just gonna sit on my hands. Okay. Okay, that feels even worse. And I'll see you little pumpkins later. Bye.